Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to today's seminar on EU-China relations and its polar dimension. It's Friday morning, and I really appreciate your attendance. I know many people will have gone on holidays already. And about today, I thought I would like to have an unusual opening, because most of the speakers will talk about real politics in a very pragmatic sense. So I thought I'd start with something softer. I wonder if you know Professor Loden. Some of you here might know him. He's a very prestigious, well-respected sinologist. He has retired. He is based in Stockholm, Sweden. So I have been conducting several oral history interviews of sinologists, very senior established sinologists in the Nordic countries. And Professor Loden, in one of his interviews with me, he talked to me about the early establishment of the relationship between Sweden and the People's Republic of China. And maybe allow me to read some of his sentences here, his quotes here. In China, many people know that Sweden was the first Western country to recognize the People's Republic of China. This was very much the result of the work of the then Swedish Foreign Minister, Yu-Wen. A scholar and a leading authority on international law, he exerted enormous influence over Sweden's foreign policy. He was perhaps a bit anti-American and played a crucial role in defining the role of Sweden as pursuing a policy of non-alignment, aiming at neutrality in the case of war. So when it comes to establish relationship with the PRC, it was very clear in the beginning that the People's Republic of China was set up. The government controlled all of China except the island of Taiwan. So it was natural for the Swedish government with Yu-Wen as foreign minister to recognize the new China. There were some leftists who liked communist China, but in the eyes of the broad public in Sweden at that time, it was mainly seen in a very negative light, up until the Cultural Revolution. This was, of course, a bit of a paradox, isn't it? At the time of the Cultural Revolution, when the situation in China got worse, people in Europe and also in North America started to like China. And I asked him why. He further explained, because when we read the writings of Mao Zedong, he appeared to be against the rule of experts and bureaucratism, and for a combination of redness and specialization, in Chinese, 又红又专. We felt that this was very relevant for us Swedish people, because in Sweden, experts and bureaucrats seem to have so much power that it threatened democracy. So a bit of unusual beginning. I refer to Professor Loden. He was describing the early situations when PRC and Sweden established the formal diplomatic relations. Apart from realistic calculation why Sweden should establish relations with the PRC, I guess he also referred to the general public's attitudes. And there is something about identities, how the Swedish people look at China and how they see themselves. So there is some kind of anti-Americanism, and there is some kind of looking at China, maybe what they are doing here is a symbol against what we have negatively in Sweden. So what I want to say is the factors of real politics, as well as identification, the public opinions, all matters. And this has actually never changed until today. The politics that we are going to look at today, Sino-Nordic relations, and also in general Sino-European relations, I think it's generally smooth in my view. And because of the relatively easy or okay relationship between China and Nordic countries, I think for Chinese government, this is an area that it can use to test activities that it wants to conduct in the rest of Europe. For instance, we know Iceland has signed up a free trade agreement with China, and this is more difficult to conduct if you are an EU member state. And sometimes Chinese government also try to express their views, for instance, lifting the EU arms embargo that has been placed on China since the Tiananmen Square incident. So lobbying Sweden in the hope that the voice can be heard also in EU. Also, I think China has started to develop a more clear region-wide approach. And what I mean is that China treats the Nordic country as a region that it can conduct diplomacy with, a bit similar to what China is doing with Central and Eastern Europe, where there are some EU member states and non-EU member states, and same in this part of the world. Finland, Sweden, they are EU member states, but Norway and Iceland, they are not. So, but China wants to have a regional-wide approach to this area. And in my own opinion, I think there are more track to diplomacy, meaning that non-state actors, think tanks, experts, scholars are also invited from time to time to elaborate on their views of what China and Nordic countries can cooperate. Despite all of this development, I think Nordic countries maybe have not done so well in terms of policy coordinations, meaning that dialogues between Nordic countries, what we want to do with China. And also bearing in mind there's the EU there. So how to make the EU or make Brussels less wary that China is trying to split Europe into different regions. So maybe this is the area that we have to work on. So this is a short introduction. I believe that the distinguished scholars that we have invited today will help me further elaborate on those visions. We have the honor to invite a number of scholars many from Shanghai area. The first speaker, Professor Xin Hua, he is the Executive Deputy Director of the Center for European Union Studies at Shanghai International Studies University. He is also the Director of Research from the Shanghai Institute for European Studies. He will be the first speaker to talk about China-Arctic Silk Road cooperations. And then we will have a speaker from Fudan University, Professor Chun. He will talk specifically about the economic ties between China and Nordic countries. The third speaker will be Professor Hongsong. He is the Deputy Director of Center for European Union Studies and Deputy Dean of School of International Relations from Shanghai International Studies University. His talk will be focused on China-EU cooperation and also the Arctic governance. I understand some of the audience here, our students, are very interested in this topic on the Arctics. And then we will have Finnish scholar Sanna Kopra. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Arctic Center at the University of Lapland, as well as a visiting scholar at the Aleksanteri Institute at this university here in Helsinki. So Sanna will focus on the great power climate responsibility and the China and Arctic regions. I have also invited my master students. I hope you don't mind that we will have a dialogue also with students. My student Gasper Dahlbeck, he's working on his thesis on Finland-China trade. He has a quantitative background and also some financial sector practical experiences. So I thought he can enlighten us on his own experience, what has happened between China and Finland in terms of trade. And myself, I'm developing a new project, and it is really a project in the making. So I would like to garner your view. And my talk will then focus on the Helsinki-Tallinn tunnel. And I will share with you some of my theoretical thoughts on this subject. And after the presentations, we will have two commentators to give us some feedbacks. Dr. Jyrki Kallio, he is the Senior Research Fellow from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. I guess you have some magazines of ours here. Open it. Jyrki Kallio's interview is there. Yeah. And then we have Mikko Puistinen. He's a ministerial advisor from the Finnish Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment. I don't know if you know him, but he's quite famous in Finnish media. And when Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Finland, he also played a very significant role in this event. So I'm very delighted that we have the ability to invite all of you real China experts to this seminar today. Without further ado, I think I should then give the floor to Professor Xin Hua. Thank you.
So when shall I end my presentation here?
I will give you a hint. If
so it's okay.
Yeah.
All right. So it's my great honor to come here as the first speaker about the cooperations between China and the Nordic countries. And so here, first I want to talk about the China's Arctic Silk Road cooperation with the Nordic regions within these grand strategic relations. First, I think that perhaps we need to get some understanding over some basic ideas. Here I'm going to talk about the 4 points, 4 aspects. The first is that about the connecting points about China's Belt and Road Initiative and the Europe's Eurasia connectivity strategy. And then I will just focus on some internal and external factors that actually influence or shape the cooperations between China and Europe, and particularly China and the Nordic countries in this field. And then I will take some review over the potential and the prospects of the China-Europe cooperation related to Arctic affairs. As for the China's One Belt, One Road initiative, or Belt and Road Initiative in its official name, that this is a grand plan. And here we can just have a look over all the major aspects of it. And here I make a summarization according to my own understanding based on all the policy documents. And here I think that this Belt and Road Initiative actually involves many different aspects, and also it is actually connecting with many different regions of the world. So this is a grand plan, and this is a plan for the joint promotion of the regional and intra-regional and inter-regional economic cooperation. So this is a grand plan, and it has already been implemented or pushed forward for several years. And this is a general map showing the general idea. And this is a grand plan, but also at the same time, there is a European plan for connecting the Asia and the Europe. And this is a document issued by the European Union. And we could perhaps find some connecting points that could just offer some background and also some framework that could push forward the China and Europe's cooperation in this region. And the first, I think that these are the several points that I summarizes from the major connecting points that could connect China's BRI with the Europe's Eurasia connectivity strategy. The first is that I think that both strategies to some degree emphasizes the constructions of the infrastructure, and particularly there is an emphasis on the transport, the inland transport. And also I think that both strategies, from my understanding, also emphasizes some transport through the sea route, through the seas. And also there's some joint investment on some important infrastructure projects that could not only improve the transport, but also improve the energy systems in some of the relatively underdeveloped regions or areas of the Eurasian continent. This is my understanding. Of course, any criticism or comment is welcome. And for China, you know that Eurasia is a very large area. It covers a huge area of the earth. For China to transport its commodities, its products to Europe, it usually is relatively a very costly task, and either through the sea route or through the railways. If it is through the railways, we know that actually in the year around 2017, that there is a long-term railway that already being put into implementation from the Yiwu of the Zhejiang province of China all the way to the Madrid in Spain, that is actually connecting the different sections or points of the existing railway to transport China's commodity. Yiwu is a quite interesting and important city in the Zhejiang province of China. It is famous in China for producing some labor-intensive small products that seem to be small, but in Yiwu it could be produced in large quantity, and it finds a large market in the Europe. But for every year, relatively for every month, there will be large quantities of the products be transported from EU all the way to Europe. If it is through the sea route, it will be relatively through a long time. So from the China side, we think that perhaps we could just build a railway. But even this railway, it is still very long and it is still relatively costly. So that's the reason that this is the railway system. So that's the reason that we consider just why we could just perhaps for some degree to shorten the sea route transportation. And because of this consideration that the Arctic cooperation enters into the agenda of the China's policymakers. And also we should think that we should know that the Arctic region, and due to its commercial potential, has already attracted the attention not only from China, but also from Japan or South Korea. So it's a common interest in the East Asia region. Now, traditionally, from the literature and from the practical records, there are already several sea routes that are already identified in the Arctic region. And these sea routes seem to be relatively quite commercially profitable. And so not only China, I should say that, but also Japan and South Korea, for all these countries, they relatively depend on export to push forward their economic growth. And so all of these countries actually are quite interested in just pushing forward. And if we just take a sea route, not through the south, through the Indian Ocean, but through the Arctic Ocean, perhaps the total length of the transportation will be greatly shortened. And if it is shortened, then it could save more cost and it could be more profitable. So there is a lot of discussion over the commercial potential or the commercial value of the sea routes of transportation of cargo ships through the Arctic regions. So that's the general background that China raised the idea or the concept of the Arctic Silk Road. But here I'm not going to talk too much about the specific technical points about this. I'm just going to talk about some of the more strategic factors that we need to take into consideration if we think that the Arctic cooperation between the China and Europe could be viable, could be put into effect. So I think that we need to make some analysis over the domestic and the external factors that may shape, may influence, or may restrict the cooperation between China and Europe on the Arctic affairs. I think that there are some domestic factors in the Europe from Chinese perspective, that there are some factors in the domestic factors in the Europe that might just put some restricting force on the possible Arctic cooperation. The first is that we should notice that there is a trend of the widening disparities and disputes in China and Europe, in particular in the relations of trade and investment between these two large economies. The second point is that the rising populism and nationalism in the Europe that might become relatively more increasingly hostile towards China's participation in the Arctic affairs. And third is that we should say that there is inevitable misinformation or misperception or misinterpretations in the strategic assessments and orientations of both the China and the Europe that might put some restrictive force for the possible cooperation. In the past several decades, the China and Europe's relations actually has experienced some change. Originally, I think that in the 30 years from year 1979 all the way to the 2009, there is a grand triangle and the flying geese pattern that exists in the economic relations between China and Europe and the other major economies here. The so-called the Grand Triangle means that gradually since the year 1979, when the China adopted the measures of reform and opening, that China got itself more and more involved into the world economy, and because of its relatively huge labor force, which was its comparative advantage, that China offers cheap consumer goods to the Europe and the United States. Also, at the same time, it imported a lot of more sophisticated industrial goods, but not from the European Union or the United States, because the sophisticated industrial goods from the European Union and the United States were relatively expensive. So China, mainland China, imported the technologies and the industrial goods from Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. And also at the same time, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan imported some more expensive, relatively high-tech industrial goods from the Europe and the United States. This is a grand triangle in the 30 years from 1979 to the 2009. But everything always changes. You know that in the East Asia's economy, there is a pattern which is called the flying geese pattern. This means that for each economy in the East Asia, they usually did not and would not stay on the same position in the global value chain. They will gradually manage to upgrade their position. And this is called the flying geese pattern. I think that the scholars of the economic field may be familiar with this pattern. And this pattern explains just how the position of the different economies was shifted in its total in the total economic pattern. And here it shows just how the China's trade surplus or deficit was formed. Mainly, just again, it shows a long-term trend that the Europe and the United States traditionally were two largest markets that absorbed the China's cheap consumer goods, and also at the same time, here I mean mainland China. Also at the same time, the South Korea and Japan and Taiwan could gradually offer these industrial goods, sophisticated industrial goods to China. But you could see that gradually it just decreases. These lines were on a decreasing trend, and this decreasing trend means that China already shifted its position. It's gradually shifted, and it became much less stuck to the labor-intensive positions. And well, I think time is quite limited, but here this is statistics made by the United Nations. Here you could find that gradually the high-tech manufacturers account for larger and larger share in the total export structure of China. And because of this shifting of the position, that gradually there are more and more trade disputes. And the Europe's viewpoint, the general assessment of China has changed. And that is the reason that in recent years you could find the major issues of disparities and disputes in the China-EU bilateral relations, economic relations. These disputes or these disparities occurred in trade, in investment, in industries, and in high-tech sectors. These could just change the perceptions, and it could form some kind of misperceptions from both sides toward each other, and that could put some restrictive force that may not be helpful to push forward the China-Europe cooperation. And also the rise of the populism within the Europe that might pose some hostility. I will not talk too much about this. So generally, I think there are several possible misperceptions and misinformations. First is that the European Union is viewing China now, particularly since the spring of 2019, as some kind of systematic rivals. And the second is that the European Union as a whole, and particularly Germany perhaps, is becoming more negative towards China's fundamental economic institutions. And there are some divergences between China and Europe on some regional affairs in the East Asia. And because of this, these are the restrictive force. But also there are some positive force that may help to push forward the China-Europe Arctic cooperation. The first is that I think that China and Europe, both China and Europe, are the the winners to some degree, as winners of the globalization. Without the globalization, there will be no momentum of the European integration in the 1990s. And because of this, in consideration of the retreat of the United States from the tide of the globalization, that China and Europe share some common concerns. over how to push forward the globalization, and also the China and the Europe share some common desires to improve the multilateral trade system and the global governance. And the regional affairs in the Arctic cooperation on the Arctic cooperation issues could be regarded as part of the global governance issues. So on these issues related to global governance, the China and Europe could share much more cooperation. And also, I think that now on the Arctic region affairs, it seems that the United States and Russia and Canada, these are the three most important players, and they perhaps, to some degree, share some momentum to some degree to monopolize the Arctic affairs. And both the China and the European countries do not want these largest powers to monopolize the Arctic affairs. So this is domestic factors. And as for the external factors, that are shaping the possible China and Europe Arctic cooperation, I think the most important factor is the United States. If you look at the United States, you can find that the United States really has a very strong influence. The strategic orientations from the Trump administration and the perceptional influence, and also the trilateral strategic collaborations between the United States, Europe, and Japan, all these are important factors that are actually shaping the China-Europe cooperation, possibility of the more cooperation in the Arctic affairs. And here, this is a table that I summarized over the influences of the United States over the Europe, particularly the economic nationalism, the state mercantilism, and the protectionism that initiated by the United States and also influence the European perceptions. So these are the factors of restrictions and factors of positive force. So how could we push forward the cooperation on the Arctic affairs in the future? And here I think there are three directions that maybe we could consider to push forward our bilateral cooperation. First is the joint technological development. I think that technology could be much less sensitive, could be much less ideological sensitive. The technological development for the maritime navigation and environmental protection and global climate governance. These issues could offer some platform for more cooperation, and particularly now the Chinese scholars are also very interested in the global climate governance. So this means there is a potential. And also there could be some large-scale projects for exploring natural resources. And also there could be more institutionalized cooperation between China and Europe and between East Asia and Europe in the Arctic Council and other international bodies. So I should say that the Arctic region is concerned not only by China, but also by many other East Asian countries. So this is a quite hot topic in the East Asia area. There could be more inter-regional cooperation. Okay, so these are my points. Thank you very much. Okay.
So our next speaker is Professor Deepening from Fudan University.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for Professor Chen and also Confucius Institute here to invite me here to give this opportunity to make exchange with the prestigious colleagues and also students. Since Professor Xinhua has already talking about EU-China relationship, so I focus more on China and Nordic countries. So the topic of my presentation is economic and trade cooperation between China and Nordic countries. So my topic will divide into three parts. The first, I will give a brief introduction about the status quo of economic and trade tie between China and Nordic countries. Second, the cooperation with the focus of Polar Silk Road Initiative, and then I will switch to actually the economic and trade cooperation between China and Finland here. So as a whole, I will give a very brief comment about the status quo of economic tie between China and Nordic countries. So regarding the trade, China ranks first as a source for Nordic imports and second as a destination for Nordic exports among non-European states. When people are talking about investment, bilateral investment has become increasingly active for bilateral economic relationship between these two countries and region. The fields that invested are increasingly diverse. So here, bilateral trade developed rapidly, indicating a closer trade relationship. Sino-Nordic trade of goods accounts for about 5% of Nordic total external trade, and about 7% of Nordic countries' total import, and 4 points of Nordic countries' total exports are with China. So no further expansion of trade imbalance, paving way for a more balanced trade relationship. So you can also see this graph, which I shows here. And when people talking about trade, the trade growth slowed down since the European debt crisis, but gained steam since 2017. So here you can see the imports, export, and also the balance, the deficit. Yeah. So here, when people talking about the share of the trade between China and other countries, this graph just shows these kind of the division. Sweden, Norway, Denmark accounts for 78% of the total trade value. Finland accounts for 20% of the total value. The distribution of trade is correlated to the size of economy of each Nordic countries. And here, one by one, here you can see the graph indicates the trade between China and Iceland, China and Norway, China and Sweden, as well as Denmark, China, and also Finland, China. So here you can see the imports, exports, and also deficits, or as well as these surplus. So here, when people talking about actually the Nordic countries' export to China, the distribution of the products as the exporter to China, here we can see mechanical and electronic products. It has a very big portion. And then we have different others like minerals, papers, transportation equipment, laser products, opticals, clocks, live animals, chemical products. Yeah, here, actually I just want to give you a brief idea about the the distribution of Nordic countries' export to China. And in turn, here we have another picture which want to give you a distribution of Nordic countries' imports from China. Yeah, it's a little bit similarizing if you have a look of the different portion of different kinds of products. Yeah, so which I think means that both sides, with time has been, it's more and more switched to so-called intra-industry trade. So the Nordic exports to China distributes in machinery. Yeah, here focused on Sweden, Finland, commodities, more Norway, laser products, that's Denmark, and seafood, Iceland. The Nordic imports from China are generally mechanics and electronic products, textiles and rural materials, furniture, toys, and etc. The trade structure between China and Nordic countries indicates a very strong complementary, which means that actually we help each other and also make for these kind of wares. So when we switch to the investment, so here we have a graph which indicates China's outwards FDI to Nordic states both flow as well as stocks. So here you can see China's outwards FDI to Nordics declined slightly from 2014 to 2016. A large number of investments which are from Norway. And then China's outwards FDI to Nordic states start to rise again in 2016. Both sides have reached deeper cooperation in high technology, clean energy, and the other advanced fields. So here, as a whole, we can see that the Nordic countries' outwards FDI to China's flows actually it's quite diverse. When people talking about each country of Nordic groups, here you can see different direction. So here we can see Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Norway, Iceland. So we all know that here people talking more about these mergers and acquisitions. So I just give some case which actually could regard it more in these fields. Bilateral cooperation. We all know the Geely merge Volvo, which is a very big merge between China and Nordic countries, make a record outwards FDI from China to Nordic countries. And then we have also R&D facilities. Here we will take Huawei, the center here in Finland, and also Breivik, a sewage treatment company in Norway, Aircom, a leading enterprises of silicon material industry in Norway, and also Anta Sports Products Limited, merged this Amber Sports Corporation, and also Nordic Cinema Group, which actually was a corporation of Wanda Group from mainland China. And no doubt we have also a cooperation between Tencent and Supercell, which is more these telecommunications. So here I rather to focus more on the case of M&A of Geely Volvo. Actually, the deal was created in the year 2010. Total amount account for $1.8 billion for 100% equity of Volvo. The reason and the motivations for these kind of mergers is the negative influence of economic crisis on Ford. Geely focused on Volvo's brand and the core technology, and also Volvo focused on the potential market for high-end cars in China. And also when people talking about the risk for this M&A, first, risk for maintenance of our brand reputation, and second, risk of our ownership and access to key technologies, and also intellectually property rights, and also risk for cultural conflicts, as well as financial risk, and also risk for high-end talent trend. And let us see a bit about the financial performance analysis of these Geely's merge of Volvo. So at first year, no doubt we have some loss as usual, and then within 3 years, the financial indicators were still quite good. That means this kind of merger was really successful, and also I think Volvo has not only remain its employee, especially it's expand its employee skills, especially in Ghent in Belgium. So this is really a very good example for mergers between Geely and Volvo. So here are some tables which I just want to give you the evidence that these kind of mergers good, especially after 3 years. So it's more and more go positive. When people talking about the financial items, and then I switched to the cooperation for Polar Silk Road initiative. I think that's also a hot issue nowadays. Yeah. When people talking about the motivation or motives of cooperation, Arctic demands for maritime transport, like Professor Xinhua has already mentioned, the establishment of Arctic roads will decrease the distance of transportation and fuel consumption by about 20% as well as 40% respectively. And also Arctic road is safer than the other roads when people are talking about these turbulence and also the piracy. Yeah. And then no doubt about the demand for cooperation in marine science innovation. Yeah. The Nordic countries ranked first in marine science innovation, renewable energy, green ship technology, marine stable management, seabed mineral extraction, bioeconomy, carbon capture, and also when people talking about the existing cooperation between China and Nordic regions, I just listed some of them, like bilateral agreement for cooperation. We have this framework agreement, Arctic cooperation with Iceland in 2012, jointly building maritime infrastructure. We know China's first Arctic research station near Aleksanteri in Norway, and a continuous cooperation in traditional fields like joint fossil fuel exploration with Norway, Iceland, and also jointly building research think tanks like China-Nordic Arctic Research Center, which is established in Shanghai, and also more these kind of researches on Arctic Circle, Arctic Frontier. Yeah. So the Polar Silk Road Initiative, yeah, which utilizing the Arctic resources in a lawful and rational manner, and also deepening exploration and also understanding of Arctic, and also participating actively in Arctic governance and international cooperation. I think colleague Liu will also discuss talking about this. Yeah. And here we can see that in the year 2016, One Belt and One Road plan or initiative for maritime cooperation. And then in 2018, China issued a white paper, China's Arctic Policy, which actually give explanation about Chinese policy, Chinese views on Arctic cooperation. And also the Polar Silk Road Initiative could be a valuable platform for the cooperation between China and Nordic countries. So here, just a map which I want to show that the development and also the utilization of Arctic shipping roads will greatly change the world shipping pattern, and also the Arctic roads combined with Arctic Railway will no doubt reduce time and carbon emission, which is really good for climate change. And when people talking about Polar Silk Road, we also will touch with the rich energy reserve in Arctic region. Yeah, so here I think China are willing to make cooperation with the Nordic countries and also the other countries which are affiliated. So here I just listed the projects between China and Russia, and we also know that fragile ecological environment. When people talking about Arctic Circle, that's also a very important issue. China advocates the protection and the rational utilization of the Arctic, and encourage enterprises to make full use of their own capital, technology, and domestic market advantages to utilize Arctic resources through international cooperation. When people talking about this kind of cooperation, no doubt we're also talking about the cooperation in the fields of infrastructure. So here, Norway and Finland have announced plans to build an overland railway and submarine tunnel connecting the Eastern Passage in the Arctic Circle. I think Professor Chen will later also discuss about this tunnel. And also, as far as I know, China-Finland Railway Express was started in 2018. There's Tokyo and Xi'an. About 70% of the money spent on the tunnel projects is expected to come from China. That's only what I learned. And then I will switch to more the bilateral economic relationship between China and Finland. So here I have this graph which indicates actually the trade between Finland and China. So here we can see that actually both sides have strengthened the economic tie. So we have this value. Actually, that indicates the sovereign debt crisis, which make a bit decline, but gradually with the economic recovery, it's kept stable. So here, these two graphs just show that the distribution of Finland's exports to China, as well as the distribution of Finland's imports from China. So both sides, I think that the main parts is mechanical and electronic products, which I think actually indicates, like I already mentioned, the so-called intra-industry trade. That was no doubt with the upgrading of Chinese manufacturing. So China's outwards FDI to Finland. So here both flows and stocks. You can see China's outwards FDI to Finland stock experienced a period of stable increase. Yeah, and also Finland and China made a new agreement on expanding bilateral cooperation between countries on technological innovation, and clean energy, as well as urbanization and stable energy in 2013, especially with the visit of President Xi Jinping here. So here just give you actually the types of this kind of investment. So here you can see that about 37% were in sales and marketing, and the rest are manufacturing, administration, and service, as well as R&D. So here, actually, that's the comparison of investment characteristic between China and Finland. Yeah. So here I just listed the fields investment, the regional investment, and also change of investment. Yeah. So here you can see that actually the differences between these two. So the Chinese investors' motives for investing in Finland, so resources seeking, FDI, market seeking, FDI, as well as the efficiency seeking, FDI. Yeah, no doubt we have also these so-called strategic asset seeking, FDI, which focus more on innovation and adoption of new technologies. Yeah. So actually, there is also some, I think, obstacles like capital account control, and also something regarding this taxation, and also the governmental incentives, and also the brand is not that well known for Chinese investors. So in the end, actually, I want to give a very brief introduction about the Chinese deepening of opening up, which President Xinhua has already mentioned, that there is actually disputes or increasing dissatisfaction from European continent, but actually China has strengthened its deepening up of opening up and reform. So here I just take two examples. One is the establishment of FTZ, first in Shanghai, and then to the other 11 or 13 sports, which actually China wants to measure the gap from the request from outside, especially from the high advanced economy, includes European Union and member states of the European Union, Japan, United States, and the status quo of Chinese level nowadays and want to find out a solution to minimize this kind of gap. The representative of this kind of experiment is actually always shortening a negative list of market access. We all know that this year we have amendment of a new foreign investment law, which allows the foreign investors solely have the holding, and also we actually strengthening the opening up of financial markets and withdraw the limitation of foreigner to hold the Chinese options in Chinese financial markets. So I think that's my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Next speaker is Professor Hongsong from Shanghai International Studies University.
Okay. First of all, many thanks for Confucius Institute's invitation. My topic is about China-EU cooperation and active governance. Active governance is not only about maritime navigation issues mentioned by Professor Xinhua and Professor Chen. The Arctic issues cover a wider range. The issues like climate change, the natural resources utilization, maritime investigation, Arctic people, protection of Arctic people's rights. All these issues belong to Arctic issue. Many issues like climate change have implications at the global level. So active governance has close relevance to global governance. This is the background that countries like China, countries outside the Arctic region, engage in active governance. There's only one international treaty that regulates active governance. It is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Nevertheless, this convention was not formulated for the purpose of active governance. It is for the purpose of the sea governance. So many issues relating to active governance are not mentioned in the United Nations Convention on the Sea, Law of the Sea. There's no treaty like the Untitled Treaty in active governance. The countries surrounding the Arctic region, all the countries which have territory in the Arctic region have no interest in reaching such a treaty like Arctic Treaty. There's only one multilateral institution. Actually, it is an intergovernmental dialogue institution, namely the Arctic Council in the field of Arctic governance. This council was established in 1996. The countries that have territory in the region are members of this council. They include the U.S., Russia, Canada, and 5 European Arctic countries. The next part is about the EU's participation in Arctic governance. Just now, as I mentioned the Arctic Council. There are 5 EU. There are 3 as the EU members in the Council: Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. And two other European countries are also members of Arctic Council, Norway and Iceland. In addition to these European members, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, and the Netherlands are also formal observers of this council. However, these European countries represent their own interests rather than the EU in Arctic Council. The EU has applied to be an observer of Arctic Council, but up to now, it has not been approved by the Council. The European Union has engaged actively in active governance in the document issued in 2007, Maritime Policy Actions. It was said that the European Union has a strong interest in participating in active governance. In another policy document issued in 2008, the European Union and the Arctic region, the European Union has announced its issues it has in which it has interest. In 2012, the European Union issued the policy papers, developing European Union policy towards the Arctic region. Progress since 2008. Next steps. There are some relatively concrete measures in the fields like scientific research, climate change, natural resources utilization, fishery, which have been mentioned in this policy paper. And in the EU's scientific development plan, Horizon 2020, the EU announced that it will invest 20 million euros every year in scientific research regarding active governance. So all these suggest that the EU participated in active governance actively. In regard to China-U.S. EU cooperation in active governance, first of all, we need to notice the establishment and development of China's EU strategic partnership. Since because this strategic partnership is about various dialogue mechanisms between China and the EU at various levels. China and the EU discussed Arctic governance issues both at the summit level and ministerial level. The two sides announced a joint communique in 2012. They recognized the increasing importance of the Arctic region. And in 2013, China and the EU committed to strengthen exchanges on Arctic affairs. As well, China and the EU have conducted a lot of academic exchanges on the issue of active governance. For instance, universities or think tanks from China and the Nordic countries have jointly held some international conferences, both in China and in Europe, in the field of Arctic governance. The last part is the prospect of China-EU cooperation. China and the EU have similar policies on the issues of climate change and free navigation. This lays the foundation for China and the EU to conduct mutual cooperation on in Arctic governance. But there are some impediments or obstacles facing China and the EU. China is not a country that has a territory as in Arctic region. So China is perceived as an outsider. So if China engages too much in Arctic governance, the legitimacy would be questioned by other countries, particularly by Arctic countries. So China's restrained itself from engaging too much in Arctic issues. Secondly, European Union members, many European Union members have their own Arctic policies. Countries like Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Poland have issued their own policy papers on Arctic governance. So it would be hard for these European Union members to reach agreement on concrete measures, regarding Arctic governance, and this impedes China and the EU from further cooperation. Against this backdrop, China took measures to strengthen cooperation between itself and some Nordic countries. For instance, China and Iceland have signed a framework agreement on Arctic governance. In addition, China and Iceland have conducted joint scientific investigation on issues like climate change and natural resources utilization. I think this trend will last in the foreseeable future, because there are some obstacles between China and the EU in Arctic governance cooperation. Such is my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
So, thank you. My name is Sanna Kopra. I come from the University of Lapland, and I'm going to talk about China and great power responsibility for climate change, especially in the Arctic region, but also in general. My presentation builds on, or basically it's an introduction to a book chapter that was published a month ago, if I remember correctly. It was part of the book Climate Change and Arctic Security, Searching for a Paradigm Shift. It was edited by Lassi Heinin and Heather Exner-Piro. And actually Heather uploaded the whole book on her, what's the name? ResearchGate? Yeah, ResearchGate profile. So you can find the whole book open access there if you are interested in this topic. And this the first paragraph is a quote from the introduction of this book. So the basic idea of this book is that because of climate change, we have to change the ways we define international security issues. Climate change has to be seen as a security threat, and it has to be taken account in security discussions. And in my contribution to this book, I focus on the role of great powers I don't remember the title of my chapter, but it's something about China and great power responsibility and Arctic security or something like that. And I focus on China's great power responsibility for climate change in that chapter. And because in my view, if we securitize climate change, then it means that great powers have special responsibilities for climate change mitigation and adaptation, because great powers have special responsibilities for the maintenance of international peace and security. And I have background in international relations, so for those of you who are familiar with these theories, I built on the English school theory of international relations. I think this theory is very unique in several ways. First of all, it's the basic premise of the English school theory is that states form this international society, and because states are members of international society, they have a common interest, common values, common norms. So in contrast to mainstream IR theories which think that international politics are only about struggle for power and this kind of competition between states, this takes more kind of positive approach towards international relations. And because states form this international society, the concept of great power is very important for this theory. The English school theory assumes that great powers have a special role in maintenance or sustaining and organizing this international society, because they are the most powerful players. But in contrast to, for example, realist school, which thinks, also liberalist and other mainstream IR theories thinks that great powers are, well, the concept of great power is mainly seen as related to material capabilities of great powers. If you have nuclear powers, if you have economic power, then you are defined as a great power. But of course, English school also thinks that capabilities of states are important, but that they are not enough. You have to have also an identity of a great power, and other states, especially other great powers, have to recognize that you have this status. And I think this is the main reason why we are not always in agreement whether or not China is a great power. Some people say that, or some scholars say that China is a great power. Some say that it's only an emerging great power. So what interests me is that what criteria China should fulfill in order to be seen as a great power. And I think this is the responsibility is the key in this question, because clearly the Western states and China have different kind of opinions, ideas, what it means to be responsible in international society. And contemporary international practices are, or contemporary international society sees very Western Eurocentric ideas that constitute the great power responsibility. So from the English school theory point of view, great powers have to have they have to be recognized by others to have, and also conceived by their own leaders and peoples to have special rights and responsibilities in international society. And this responsibility was written in UN Security Charter in 1945, which says that the permanent members of UN Security Council have a primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. So, and permanent members of the UN Security Councils are, of course, great powers. Well, at least they were at the time when the United Security Council was established. Now we can, of course, have argued that all the great powers are not there, or some of the members of council are no longer great powers. But that's a different discussion, of course. But yeah, and I've studied the ways in which the UN Security Council discusses or defines climate change, and they haven't made any resolution, I mean formal resolution on climate change, but they have discussed climate change several times. 2007, 2009, 2011, maybe also 2013, and in the beginning of this year they also discussed this issue, but they haven't made any formal resolution on the issue yet. But anyway, this indicates, at least for me, it indicates that climate change is being securitized by the UN Security Council, and we can at least see that there's some kind of informal norm that expects great powers to shoulder special responsibility for climate change. And I don't think this norm will ever be written in any international agreements, but it's a social norm that plays a role in international society. And because China is a member of UN Security Council and it's a great power, it has special responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. And if we see climate change as an issue of international security, then China can't fulfill this responsibility if it doesn't have access to all these forums where issues of international security are discussed. And of course, the Arctic Council is not one of those forums. Its mandate doesn't include international security issues, but it focuses on sustainable development. But if climate change is fully securitized, I don't know if this will change or not, but it's also one of the things that we should ponder. And my book on China and great power responsibility for climate change was published a year ago. And in this book, I study the ways, as I already said, the way how UN Security Council and the way China has defined great power responsibility, especially in the context of climate change. And I argue that we can identify two based on the English school theory, we can define two ethical kind of reasoning why great powers have to, or we can expect that great powers shoulder special responsibility for climate change. The first one is based on the fact that climate change is a source of international security conflicts, and it's an international security threat, and because great powers have this special responsibility for maintenance of international peace and security, then they have special responsibility to address climate change so that the dangerous climate change will be prevented and these conflicts related to climate change are prevented. And in the book, I call this functional great power responsibility, but I must say that I'm not very happy about this definition, so I'm still working on this issue. And the second one is based on cosmopolitan ethics. It focuses on human security issues, and it's based on the fact that climate change causes harm to the well-being of human beings around the world, and because great powers have also special responsibility for the justice amongst or within the international society, therefore they should also take the lead in international climate politics. So they have also this diplomatic responsibility to put forward political will and this kind of things that are important to promote more ambitious climate policies at a global level. Yeah. So in the book, I argue that China has started to see climate change as an attribute of great power responsibility. It has undergone very dramatic change in its climate policies. I mean, compared to the ways, compared to its rhetoric in 1990s, today China really recognizes its responsibility for climate change, and there has been a huge difference from the earlier position. But when it comes to the Arctic policy, China's Arctic strategy, which was published last year, January, it also describes China as a responsible major country, but it doesn't make any kind of reference to China's great power responsibility for climate change. But of course, it's obvious that China doesn't define itself as a great power in the Arctic context, because that's what, well, you know, Russia and the United States wouldn't like it, so it wouldn't be very good way to describe China, of course, and that's clear that they don't do that. But it still hints that there can be some kind of great power responsibility attached to China's Arctic role because of the role of the UN Security Council to maintain peace and security and stability in the Arctic region. And of course, China doesn't mention the rights of great powers in the Arctic context, because that would also be contradictory to China's image and China's role in the Arctic. So this is not something that we would expect China to do, and it wouldn't be welcomed by the regional states. And yeah, and also when it comes to discourses of international security, China's Arctic strategy pays more attention to global governance of Arctic region. So this could also have some kind of impacts on international security discourses. But when it comes to China's great power responsibility for climate change in the Arctic context, it's China's Arctic policy. Of course, it discusses climate change a lot because it's one of the key drivers of China's Arctic policy, of course. But it doesn't make any additional, or it doesn't introduce any additional measures how China would mitigate climate change. And because China is the biggest CO2 emitter in the world, of course, its ambitious climate policies do affect the future of the Arctic. So in the Arctic strategy, China could have announced new ways to mitigate climate change, because there are a lot of domestic incentives in China to decrease the use of coal and these kind of things. So there would be many things that they can do and are willing to do and will do. So this would be a good chance for the Chinese to promote their image as a great, responsible climate great power and also legitimate China's role in the Arctic context. So I think China lost this great opportunity to convince the world about its commitment to climate change mitigation, and because after Trump was elected, the world has started to expect China to be the next climate leader, and this would have been one chance to somehow answer these expectations. So my conclusions are therefore that even though China has defined climate responsibility as an attribute of great power responsibility at global level, it hasn't done that in the Arctic context. And as I already said, that taking this stronger role, China could have also improved its image, and this would also legitimate China's role in the Arctic. And because because climate change is not fully securitized, I don't think that there's this dramatic change in the ways we defined responsibilities of great powers, because it's not really seen as an international security threat. So I don't know if it's likely that China or the United States will define it as such as in coming years. And what I'm like to do next is that I wanna study how could China, I mean, China is an external state, the Arctic, so how could it even play a leadership role in the Arctic climate change mitigation? Maybe not. Or same goes with the the EU. How could China and EU somehow take this leadership? But can they even take this leadership role because they are not one of the Arctic Club states of this Arctic Club? And also, how do we define what means to be a leader in international climate politics? There's a lot of talk about leadership. The EU wants to be a leader of international climate politics, but it doesn't really have any followers. So can you be a leader if you don't have followers? And does China have different kinds of definitions of this leadership compared to other states? And how can you be a leader in Arctic climate change mitigation? That's, I mean, in theoretical terms, it's a very interesting question. And also, of course, important for the future of the Arctic. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And moving away from the Arctic, now we have Kasper. We will talk about Finland's trade with China. I think maybe somewhat overlap with Professor Dingchen's
Yes.
part, but you can skip the overlap part
Or
and focus on the new part.
all right. Hello, everybody. I'm Kasper Dahlberg, and this I have a short presentation of Finland-China trade, and this is mainly based on my master's thesis about the topic, and I have previous also knowledge in economics, which I studied before Chinese studies in here, and this is will be based on Finnish Finland-China trade, and most focus on the recent times, but I have also a historical part, and it's mostly I will go through the development of China-Finland trade, and also in the end there will be a linear regression and gravitational modeling have been done on the economic model of gravitation in trade relations concerning China, Finland, as well as WTO membership on Chinese access, how it affected the trade. And this is, I have a structure of this, and it will be firstly about history of Finland-China trade and how it began. Then it's more like about exports and imports between Finland and China. Then a little bit about the politics affecting the trade between the two countries, and then a little bit short about the investments which have been happening recently between Finland and China, and then the gravitational model and the results of it, and then I will end up in a conclusion. And then starting about the history, Finland first made a trade agreement with China in 1953, and it was like just a couple years after 1952, Finland opened embassy and both started bilateral relations recognition in 1950s. And in the first period, this trade was done through Soviet Union, with the ruble first acting as currency. And Finland even did trade while the United Nations had boycotted China during the aftermath of the Korea War. Finland was kindly halved as a part trade of which the goods went to the Western world. And after this was the opening up period of Finland and China. And Finland signed with China in 1979 an agreement on bilateral agreement concerning economic, industrial, technological, and scientific cooperation between the countries. And then in 1985, a joint venture company law was passed in China, so foreigners could start to better invest in Chinese and make foreign direct investments, and this was then by first Finnish companies made in 1986 direct investments into Chinese, while the invest then before being just a trade relation between the countries also became partly investment relations between the two countries. And then in the years 1990 92 and 2001, and we could see a kind of big growth in investment between trade with China and Finland, and many of the major Finnish companies was just in this time establishing factories in China, including many of the still having factories there. And same time under this period, Finland entered the EU, so many of the trade policy of tariffs and others entered more an European context, while Finland were more putting bilateral or more political relationships on politics to improve the relations, not directly the legal framework around this. And after this, in 2002 to 2008, we could see really the biggest growth in the trade activities, especially from Chinese part after it entered the World Trade Organizations, and there was still a continuing expansion of Finnish companies, now directly more maybe even shifting factories from Finland or other to China to direct make export goods from China. And this is the reason why the many big trade difference, trade balance is the biggest widening under this period. And then after this, it's like after the financial crisis and aftermath, this was more sluggish trade and slower growth in it, and more going more to a balance between the trade again between the two countries' imports and exports. Okay, and here I have about 2008 export to China, and we could see that nowadays pulp had been the biggest exporting sector. This was not always the case, you can see later, and there have been machinery and other goods as well as nickel. I think here we can see the share of this is of total Finnish export share, and we can see the in the time of beginnings it started to grow in especially after 1990s onwards up to around 2000 and still on a growing pattern, but it's more like been some jumping growth, and nowadays it has been growing all in importance, the share of Finnish exports into Chinese and reached the biggest share of the statistics in 2007. I don't have it for 2008 yet, but it has been like growing, and Chinese is becoming one of the biggest export markets, or it's the biggest export markets after in Sweden and Germany, and also China is like the biggest non-European countries regarding imports and exports for Finland. And then we can see the categories. This was I have for 2002, and it has been like long shifting between different goods export from Finland. And before this was the trade, there was a typical case that Finland exported more machinery, mechanical, electric machinery and stuff, especially as long as we had Nokia and other stuff. While now in the recent, especially aftermath of financial crisis, and there have been more diversion in categories of products exported into of Finnish exports in the Chinese market, as well as not being Finland anymore a high-tech exporter just, but Finland has also become more export of raw materials as well as forest products like pulp and other minerals like nickels, which have been really important to Chinese economy, as there is some sort of more lack of natural resources of this kind there, while they before used to produce themselves, but the market grown that much. Okay, and then these Finnish imports or Chinese exports. This is 2008 figures, and we can see it's somewhat little bit similar goods as Finland export, but it's electric machinery and some clothing and furniture, and it's toys and some little bit more consumer goods and opticals. And here is the share, and we can see that Chinese, especially the period after WTO, China had a really huge growth in its export share of Finnish imports to China, and it was like in this period percentage share of Finnish total exports over doubled in just a few 5 years, while after the financial crisis the share of Finnish imports from China has been more stable and not growing in the total, more growing in the same space as imports in general. And then we see the categories. It's also like we could see the clear shift. It's becoming more that China has this electric machinery. Before it was more electronic machinery and equipment, and now it's more more other machinery equipment. Furthermore, you can see like this very low quality textiles and footwear, something being shifting less to imports from China, and more China going up the ladder in the high value chain to more complex goods in imports to Finnish market, while still keeping many of the consumer manufactured goods in imports. And then shortly about politics. And Finland and China has done a lot of trade, and these agreements are mainly in the legal case often done through EU or WTO agreement regarding tariffs and trades and quotas and whatsoever. And but the importance of bilateral trade deals are more like personal, trust-wise, and of course partnerships have been done, while often the Finnish politicians travel to China. I think there's yearly ministerial travels between the countries, as well as the Xi Jinping visited Finland 2017, and Sauli Niinistö went already in January this year to China. So there's frequent political, even high-level relations between the countries. And so far, Finland and China has had kind of good political relations between each others. There has been no major backslashes. Even Finnish Pertti Salolainen visited China just after Tiananmen Square accident, so Finland was not really criticizing that much China. And in case if there is total more criticism, Finland doesn't do it personally own country. It's more like a part of a bigger Western consort of many countries together if there's some critics, while Finland is more private in publicly of politician and elite, more quiet of any bad internal affairs of China. And this can be seen that Finnish foreign policy when to trade is more like economic than so much direct human rights issues, especially concerning when they're balancing it between the trade relations between the countries, and compare, for example, Sweden had some critics of booksellers and Norway Nobel Prizes. This haven't happened to Finland for being a close one, or South Korea and others. And now then about the investment between the countries. Finnish companies started to invest in China in the mid-80s, and now they are like 11 billion, with around 350 companies being active as of end 2018 in China. And many of these are in fields Finland is in general strong of: paper, industrial, telecommunication, manufacturing fields, by many Finnish companies having factories inside China. And they are like many of these Kone, UPM, Nokia and other big Finnish companies have production facilities in China. And Chinese investments, on the other hand, started a little bit later to come into Finland. And but already like since 2012 it has grown, like most of these investments have gone, and there have been up to 10 billion euros of investments, two mainly coming from the buy-up of MR Sports, so Supercells in the fields of these being like huge billion deals, will contributing to the major investments in the Finnish sectors here, and like this making Finland like I think fourth biggest country in Europe receiving direct investments from China. And also there's some discussion on more direct foreign direct investments in pulp industrial sector, but this hasn't yet been that much materialized in overall sense. And then I made some modeling, and this is majorly principal gravitational models. I don't know how many is familiar with them, but it's simply looking about how the GDP has been affecting the trade. And the main conclusion from this that we can see that both Finnish and Chinese GDP directly affects the trade flows between the countries, and we can see that both constants positive here, and it has been like this case overall. And same when it goes to WTO, we could not see it from Finnish side, but the WTO membership directly strongly affected Chinese exports to Finland by having huge positive effects on the growth in the export to Finnish market from China, and this has been one of the major issues or relations with China. Got it huge export boom into Finland and other Western countries following the membership of the World Trade Organization for Chinese part, while the export directly from Finland didn't come this way, but a little bit later, more stronger. And okay, and then I have a short conclusion. And share of Finland-China trade have been increasing, and it's now like Finnish sector exports to China has been growing more, like it's more shifting in the categories for not just high-tech production to more like raw material pulp and more diversified. The same has happening from Chinese, but different categories growing in strong, and China has more different production categories, which is export to China. And there also been some sort of reduction in textile share, but high-tech has been more important for Chinese export in the Finnish economy. And also the WTO was a really important factor for China regarding its export and trade in general for this, because many could trust the legal framework and everything much better. And GDP important to this, and also the countries have kind of good relationship with each other, at least not affecting negatively the trade between Finland and China. Thank you.
So actually following Gasper's presentation in his master thesis, he also mentioned about the importance of connectivity or infrastructural developments that can improve the trade flow between the two countries. I have asked him not to talk about that because I'm going to cover it. I'm going to talk about the making of the Helsinki-Tallinn tunnel. And in fact, my project is also in the making. In the same, I still lack a proper theoretical framework. So bear with me if you feel it's immature, but I would like to garner your insights and feedback for me to improve my project. So basically the structure of my presentation, forgive me, I will have to go through some very boring political science theories and hypotheses. And then my method is actually quite straightforward. I've been conducting some secondary literature review as well as interviews with policymakers and businessmen in Finland, and to talk about how this tunnel can be realized. And then I will go through the real part, whether the tunnel can be built or not, and the different policymakers and government officials' opinion on these issues. So this is the theoretical part. I come from a political science background, and particularly international relations, but I also have worked on several sociological theories, such as interest group theories, network theories, things like this. So I realized the building of a tunnel, whether it can be realized or not, has highly related to what I have learned before, the theoretical part. And the reason is there's a lot of talk about One Belt, One Road, Polar Silk Road, and how it can be implemented in different countries. I know there are, I don't really know the exact number, but I think there are many, many countries that have officially signed a memorandum of understanding that they wish to support One Belt, One Road, or to say, my country is one of the One Belt, One Road countries. Finland is not one of them. Despite the popularity of it, I think we can count with our fingers, like what kind of project has really been realized. Of course, One Belt, One Road is rather a new concept, and to build a tunnel or to build a railway takes years. So of course, there are not many actual successful examples yet. But what we can see is, well, what is under negotiation and which project is having more progress than the others. And I'm a bit cynical. I realize if I check those numbers, there are not many projects that can be counted as successful. Yeah, despite China keeps saying, yes, many countries are supportive of this. And the problem, in my view, is we often overlook the local context in each society, in each country, whether they really see the need to build any infrastructures, and whether there are resources and policies to make this happen. And the lack of understanding of the local context leads to a lot of failures. And even theoretically and empirically or academically, I find there is lack of discussion on such issue. So I decided to take this approach by looking at the local context. And what I mean is, what are the actors who are advocating for One Belt, One Road or Polar Silk Road, and what have they done? And this is the boring part. Is more recently I've been looking into the strategic action field. This is a particular theory. Basically, it is arguing that, for instance, One Belt, One Road is an issue. So there is a socially constructed arena about this bill, about this One Belt, One Road. The nature of it is very unclear, but it will draw upon interested actors to come to this field. And then they have to establish their networks and relations, and then to see how they can realize the One Belt, One Road. And of course, in this process, you know, people come in and come out. People see the interest, they want to negotiate, but then they realize it doesn't work, they come out. So relations can be established, broken, re-established, redefined, etc., etc. I come up with this diagram just yesterday, and I hope this can persuade you of my talk. Basically, it depends on the country, of course. In a more authoritarian kind of country, such as several Central Asian countries, maybe it's the state actors that really they are taking the lead. But in more open societies in Europe, private actors, business people, they can also take the lead. And these two, they are not necessarily in competition, but you know, it could be all kinds of actors, could be individual, could be collective. And those actors, they actually have to think about, well, how do we match the interests with locals? So maybe the most important one here is to produce a localized understanding and the framing of the One Belt, One Road. For instance, now I'm going to talk about a tunnel. The main advocate for this is a private entrepreneur, Peter Vesterbacka. He keeps saying, well, Finland is part of the natural part of the One Belt, One Road. And then so in his narrative, which I will show you later on, he tried to frame Finland and the tunnel altogether to China's project. So there's they have to produce a localized understanding. And in this process, of course, we also have to translate the existing rules. You know, well, in Finland, of course, we already have regulations how to construct different projects. There are licenses, legalizations, all these processes. So the actors have to translate the rules, interests, and resources into this new arena. And of course, they also have to find supporters to give money and then to, you know, to think, well, this is going to happen, and to accommodate people with different interests. And for instance, in Finland, you know, do the local residents feel like it? In the Arctic Railway incidences that some of the speakers have been talking about, I think the issue is also concerning the Sami people's view, the local Sami people's view. Can we accommodate their interest when we build the project? And to build compromise identities to bring everybody along. I think without all these actions, there's nothing going to be realized. And But with them, then we can have a strategic action field, and it could be plural. There could be more fields. And of course, the role of government, I make a red line here. The role of government is also to endorse it, to implement, to facilitate, to implement. I think in most countries, eventually the government has to approve the project, right? So this is my theoretical framework, and I listed a number of hypotheses I decided to skip, but it echoes what I have elaborated in the diagrams. Now, talking about the Helsinki-Tallinn tunnel, to be honest, this is not a Chinese project. This is purely a European project. I think, according to the literature I can find, back in 1871, there were already discussions about building a connection between Helsinki and Tallinn. It could be a bridge, not necessarily a railway, not necessarily, but something, a long bridge to connect the two capitals. And the idea has been elaborated also by a lot of thinkers in Finland and in Estonia. So there's a historical background. I think in 2012, started the Helsinki city government realized, yes, the flow of the two capitals is increasing, and the Helsinki city government in general is supportive of having this twin city identity. So they started to investigate and got some money from the European Union to do some feasibility study. And there's also a Finland-East link project. This is directly with the Helsinki city government, basically to investigate whether this is financially feasible and sustainable, and also will it impact the environment, etc. So you can even find the detailed information of this Finland-East link project on the internet. Over the years, from 2012 on, through the discussion and the feasibility studies, I think they realized there are two main obstacles for building the tunnel. The first obstacle is geology. And this is environmental thing. You know, how do you build it and make sure the tunnel can really connect and not collapse, and not to influence the Baltic Sea ecology. So there's a real challenge here. It requires high technology. The second challenge is about money. We are talking about a lot of money, and where to get it from? Is it just the Finnish government, Estonian government, or some money from the European Union, and plus some private investments? So this is something that the city government has been feeling that they have to take a baby step. Take a baby step to realize it, and they are not in a hurry. And in the process, famous policymakers such as Risto Penttila, he has also been talking about the concept of the new Nordics. Basically, the new Nordic will include Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and Estonia. So, and if there's a new Nordic concept, according to Risto Penttila, then we also need to have some infrastructural project to connect those countries. And so this is actually originally only a European project. And where does China fit into this picture? And this is coming to my theoretical point. There has to be a localized understanding of the connection to China's project. And I guess Peter Vesterbacka became the main advocate for this project in I think very recently, 2014. He was aware of the discussion already, and then so he decided to make his own project called Finland-East Bay Area Development, or you can call it Fine East. You know, it's like a superlative term for fine. So Finland-East Bay Area project. Peter Vesterbacka, I know we have some international audience here. He is the former Angry Bird founder. And then he decided to start more exciting projects after his successful Angry Bird industry. And this is just me with him, because he has been contacting the Chinese study here and helping that we can help promote the study of Chinese language in Finland and encourage more academic, cultural, educational exchanges between the two countries. So in this process, I do have met Peter several times. In Peter Vesterbacka, he tried to bring in the Chinese money. And in order to bring the Chinese money, he needs to have a localized discourse. So I think he has been trying to say, well, Finland is a natural part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And then it will actually, once we have this project in his narrative, it will connect Asia and Europe more tightly and make Finland, being in the periphery location of Europe, can be more connected to the East and the West. So, and also in this process, he also tried to say, if we can create the tunnel, it will create a new center of gravity, where a large cosmopolitan area can boost flows of people, economy, employment opportunity, etc., etc. To be honest, I think this kind of discourse is not dominated only by Peter Westerbacka. Other thinkers like what I mentioned, Risto Pentila, and also some government officials also has the same vision that they wish there should be more connectivity. But the challenge is Peter Westerbacka's view. After I have conducted several interviews, I realized his view and his vision is not highly supported yet in the Finnish society and also in the eyes of various officials. About the city government, as I mentioned, the city government does wish to have a twin city identity and thinks that maybe in the longer term we can have this tunnel, but the city government is very cautious. They are reviewing the applications that Peter Westerbacka has been submitted, and then they are thinking whether this is feasible or not. As I understand, currently Peter Westerbacka has a lot of emphasis on the environmental impact, whether the tunnel will damage the environment. He has to provide licenses. And however, in the eyes of Helsinki city government, it seems that they require more documents than something like this. Because to build a tunnel, I think the city government expects something like 1,000 pages. And Mr. Westerbacka has not provided such a long document yet. And about Finnish government, I find it very curious because I cannot get a unified Finnish government stance on these issues. And I guess a lot of actors are actually just standing by. They are not making any stance because they don't know yet. But from informal conversations, for instance, with some officials in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I have the feeling that the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they actually don't like that a private entrepreneur can act on behalf of state to say, yes, we are part of China's One Belt, One Road, because actually Finland has not signed any agreement to be One Belt, One Road. So I think there's a conflict here between a state actor and non-state actor, and here a bit of tension. But of course, overall, what I heard from the officials, in Finland, we have a free economy, so entrepreneurs can propose what they want to do. We cannot stymie them, yeah. Estonia government, as I understand, also so far, they are not convinced of the documents that Mr. Westerbacka has provided and has been asking him to provide more information. So in a way, I think we are on a hold now. The project is on a hold because the government are not really endorsing enough for it to progress. Remember my conceptual diagram. The government eventually has to endorse, facilitate, and implement the project. To build a tunnel, you have to pass through many lanes. Who owns the lane? Eventually, it's the government. Yeah. Chinese embassy in Helsinki, my understanding is they are rather quiet. And this actually goes back to my conceptual hypothesis. Actually, I think Chinese government, when they throw out this One Belt, One Road initiative, it is a rubric that anything can come in. And it requires a local imagination, local efforts to make it realized. Then China will feel, okay, then we can chip in money, we can chip in resources. So at this point, I feel I haven't really heard anything from Chinese embassy, except maybe they have some network meeting, but they don't want to make a stance because they are waiting to see whether Mr. Westerbacka can persuade the different governmental agencies with all his documents. So I guess I leave it here, and thank you also very much for all the speakers for your insights. Now we will give the floor to our two commentators. First is Jyrki Kallio, and then Mikko Puistonen. Yeah, Jyrki.
Thank you. My name is Jyrki Kallio. I work as Senior Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. I have a very limited time, so I'll just focus on the Arctic issue. And I have a background in the Finnish Foreign Ministry. I worked as a diplomat for 18 years. And a short period of that time, I was also Finland's Arctic senior official in the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council has been mentioned several times, but the most important factor that really puts it apart from other international fora has not been mentioned, and that is the fact that it's not only intergovernmental cooperation. the indigenous peoples are represented in the Arctic Council as permanent participants. So they are sitting at the same table with the representatives of the national governments. And this is something that is quite unique in the realm of international fora and international organizations. I was at the Arctic Council when China's observership was under discussion. And the Finnish public official view was then, and as it still remains, is that Finland welcomes those countries who are able to provide resources for the kind of research that the Arctic Council does, is able to participate in the work of the working groups, and able to cooperate with the indigenous peoples' organizations. That kind of candidates for observership Finland supports. So Finland also supported China at that time. As you know, the Arctic Council is mainly working through its working groups, and those working groups are mainly doing research on environmental issues in the Arctic region. Now, of course, then the fear was that China would have perhaps some other goals than just providing for additional research and resources for the Arctic Council work. As was mentioned today, China wants to ensure that every stakeholder has the right to participate in the decision-making in the Arctic. So does China want to have a say in the Arctic? Now, this is something that the Arctic Council members, no more than the Arctic Council member states than the indigenous peoples' representatives, probably are not welcoming, because in their view, the Arctic decision-making should remain in the hands of the Arctic peoples and Arctic governments. There are no such things as near Arctic states from the point of view of the Arctic nations and peoples. Now, as I said, the Arctic Council is mainly doing environmental research. And today we have the International Climate Strike Day celebrated here in Finland. There are possibly thousands or tens of thousands of people right now in the outside the Finnish parliament. And so it is interesting that today we have not been, when we've been talking about the Arctic, we've hardly mentioned the environment at all. We mentioned climate, yes, but we've mostly been talking about seaborne transportation routes, the Polar Silk Road. Protection was mentioned, but at the same time as rational utilization. So I would think that many people who are now outside there demonstrating would fear that would feel that when we're talking about the Arctic, protection should really be in the forefront. Because as we have been listening now to the latest reports, the climate change, the estimates of its impact in the Arctic, they are really becoming more and more alarming all the time. So many people would probably say that the focus should not be in exploitation, but in environmental protection. And as Sanna Kopra pointed out, China is not showing climate responsibility in its Arctic policy, and this is not a very good sign when thinking about China's role in the Arctic. Now, finally, a word about the Arctic Railroad that has already been mentioned. There's one slide that said that Norway and Finland have published plans about the Arctic Railroad. This is not accurate, because in Finland there has been a feasibility study and the Arctic Railroad has been trashed. It is not deemed feasible. So at the moment the project is dead. But however, the Helsinki-Tallinn tunnel, and especially the private project that Julie was talking about, I was saying from the onset, when I heard about this private project about the tunnel, that from the Chinese perspective, if China wants to invest in this, the tunnel doesn't make any sense unless it is combined with the Arctic Railroad. So no wonder now that this private entrepreneur has now introduced an idea of an Arctic Railroad. Despite that the government project has been trashed, there is now a private project that is on the way. And one just has to wonder why this is and why it is done in such a hurry when it's been deemed unfeasible by the Finnish authorities, and perhaps even more importantly, the Sami people, the indigenous people that populate the northernmost regions of the Nordic countries, are against that project. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's good to be in the University of Helsinki, also my alma mater, and thank you for the Confucius Institute for the invitation. Firstly, some similar observation as Mr. Kallio previously. So I felt mainly commenting on the Chinese presenters here. So the focus was pretty much on the business economic side of things. Yes, environment was sustainably was mentioned, but maybe there was still a question, at least in my mind, how these two things can be combined, the economic benefit and protecting the environment at the Arctic. Also, I didn't hear the concept of China being a near Arctic state in these presentations. It would have been interesting to hear the viewpoints from the Chinese scholars regarding this definition. Just some observations here and comments. Regarding the Belt and Road Initiative, it was mentioned that on one hand, the railway transport is developed, and then the maritime, just to maybe more in detail. So even though this railway transportation is important, is growing, it will, in terms of the volumes, in comparison to the maritime, it will never be the same. So if there will be a maritime route from China to Europe, or Europe to China, it will be much more bigger in terms of its impact than that railway transport. There was also mentioned that while the Chinese exports in high tech in the China-Europe EU context, and while the Chinese exports in high tech to Europe have been growing, there has been also increasingly disputes between the China and EU, yes, that's correct. Of course, maybe the question also is, and maybe currently also in Europe, why the Chinese exports in high tech have been growing, and there are people who said that yes, and I think that's a valid point, that Chinese companies have been able to increase their competitiveness. They have just become better than previously, but also there are people who point out that there has been forced technology transfer and other means through which the Chinese companies have been able to get more competitiveness. So that maybe also it's a question that's discussed in Europe and around the world. It was also mentioned that China and Europe have been winners of globalization, and I'm sure, yes, I agree with that. Europe and the EU has been, and Finland also has been had gained big benefits from globalization, but maybe not all the Europeans agree with this point. There are a great number of Europeans who think that actually the Europeans have been the losers in globalization in the past few years, and that's why there is increasing nationalism in Europe also growing. It was also mentioned that regarding the exports from China to Europe and from Europe to China, more and more during the past few years, in a way, the structure of exports on both sides have become similar, and that one of the reasons being that there's more sort of intra-industry trade. But to be honest, and I think it was also when we looked at for example, what Mr. Dahlberg was there showing the structure of, for example, Finnish exports to China, Chinese exports to Finland, that more and more the Finnish and Chinese companies, for example, they are competing on the same products or in the same categories. So it's not totally sort of like a win-win situation. There is actually sort of like more also between European and Chinese companies on similar products or segments. Regarding the Chinese investments to Europe and especially Finland, so really in terms of the volume or the total volume, there has been a big increase from 2012. But as Mr. Thalberg also pointed out, in fact, two big acquisitions make more than 90% of the Chinese investments in Finland. And there's just a really small part of greenfield investments from China to Finland. Well, if we look at the Finnish investments in China, there's a lot of greenfields. It means that we have factories, plants by the Finnish companies in China, and they are there for the China market. It's difficult to move them out. If we think about these acquisitions by the Chinese companies, you can basically, in a day, you can sell your stake. So still I feel that actually the Chinese investments in Finland are just in the beginning stage. They are actually small. And if you think about the Chinese economy being 11,000 billion euros big, so I think there's still quite a lot of potential for Chinese investments in Finland. Yes, I think that those were the main points, but actually, yes. So maybe also as a conclusion, so maybe I expected more, also from the Chinese presenters talks and maybe comments on the sort of like the strategic political security, also consideration possibly by China versus the Arctic. Then was discussed. So it would be interested to hear more about that, because I think there's a fair amount of people, also including in the Nordic countries, who have a feeling of fear or worry about that. What is the on top of the business motivations? What are also not just the environmental but also political considerations that China has to develop its Arctic connection? Thank you.
Okay, so we're not live streaming anymore. So you can watch on our Facebook if you want again.